When he died a month ago, Raymond Williams was only 66. As you've seen from the opening sequence, he not only published many books, his work covered an exceptionally wide range of subjects and literary forms, from novels and plays to criticism and literary theory. Indeed, many would say that he was the most profound and consistently original thinker about society and culture since the war, at least in Britain, equal to the best of his contemporaries in Europe. This evening, a few of us meet here to pay a first informal tribute to his influence and contribution. We're going to begin with some personal recollections that may illuminate the range and style of his influence. Then, briefly, we hope to discuss the unity and scale of his legacy. Let's start with Dafydd, because Raymond didn't think of himself as British, but rather, as he said, as a Welsh European.
Although Raymond Williams lived and worked in Cambridge for most of his working life, he never left the community of Wales. And he kept a very close interest continually in the everyday politics of Wales. And there are two particular political experiences of defeat really, in which Raymond Williams helped us to keep faith. One was the great failure of the devolution campaign in 1979. And I remember after I'd had to do a very difficult interview trying to explain away the defeat in Wales, Raymond sent me a card telling me how important it was to keep faith in a very traditional Welsh way. And then again during the miners' strike, he didn't appear on the picket lines, but he appeared at meetings where he explained the reasoning behind the miners' strike, the meaning of community. And this, I think, that whole struggle was central to his understanding of what working class Welsh life was about.
From 1961 to his death, Raymond worked in Cambridge, first as a lecturer and then as a professor. Among his initial students was Terry Eagleton.
Raymond Williams and I arrived in Cambridge in the same year, in fact, in 1961. He as a college fellow, after a long stint in adult education, and me as an undergraduate, having taught for a year in a northern secondary modern school. It was hard to say which of us was the more alienated in this strange upper-class place, but the experience for me of hearing Raymond Williams lecture was quite extraordinary, because it was as though one saw somebody magnificently articulating with a kind of enviable ease and eloquence and intellectual sureness one's own most modelled and half thought out political feelings. And it was as though Raymond was giving a kind of authorization to other people to speak, to see him in that strange and really quite unlikely environment, speaking out on behalf of the dispossessed and the alienated, with a kind of shrewdness and sureness that made one wonder where this was coming from. I mean, how could a man speak with such confidence in this way if he that kind of dispossessed community himself? And I think I realized only later that Williams could speak with that kind of eloquence and serenity because of an unusually strong experience of closeness and solidarity in the working class community he came from, which I think really propelled his political project throughout his life.
I think of Raymond Williams as a political theorist, which is something very exceptional in England, and that sounds rather sort of snobbish and aloof. And I'd like to tell a story about a time when some of us were doing the interviews which ended up in Politics and Letters, and he was telling us about the people that were coming to see him as a distinguished professor and thinker. And a lot of them came from Japan. And he was telling us how they would always give him a present whenever they arrived. And after the Second War, he felt that he didn't like this sign of his status. And so a young and rather poor Japanese student came in and gave him the usual gift. And so Raymond took an object from his own desk and returned it to the Japanese. And according to Raymond, the poor man was absolutely thunderstruck and said, "Ah, so," and plunged his hand into his briefcase to find another gift so that he could establish this superior status. And then reflecting on this, Raymond said that he then felt very sorry that perhaps he had come with just the right number of Japanese gifts for the people that he had to interview. And in fact, he had actually, so to speak, sort of upset his kind of economy by this gesture of trying to establish equality. And I felt there but there was something both about the way he did seek to be very egalitarian and the way he accepted his status also, but also the way that he refused, so to speak, the glamour and fame that could have been his, because he kept true to the egalitarian feelings that he had for his work and for other people. The influence of Raymond Williams wasn't limited to those who knew and met him. Many people have been greatly influenced by reading his work, among them the writer and critic Judith Williamson.
Well, my memory of coming across Raymond Williams' work is very personal, though I never met him personally. I spent my teens raiding bookshops for the Pelicans and Penguin specials and books, which I felt would make sense in some way of the culture that I lived as a teenager and at home, television, pop music. And what I was learning at school, which nothing had really prepared me for, the kind of level of snobbishness and high culture that I was learning in my English classes, reading something like Culture and Society, the way that Williams brings together both studying literature and at the same time never letting go of lived experience and culture, made it possible for me not to go through that crisis, which I think many people do, either abandoning their home background or falling into kind of anti-intellectualism. And he seemed to bring together things which no other writer, maybe Hoggart was important too, but he brought the things together in a way that it gave me some validation for what I felt and actually emphasised that people's lived experience of culture was what mattered. I think it sort of made possible everything I've written since, but its actual importance to me at the time was that it helped me to grow up.
It was with the publication of Culture and Society in the late 1950s that Raymond Williams came to public knowledge. Stuart Hall knew him at that time.
Well, I have at least two personal memories of Raymond that are important to me. One is, I think, probably the first time I met him in 1955 or 56 in Oxford, and we were talking with him as people who'd been trained in literary criticism about the tension which we felt between, on the one hand, the sort of dominant reading of English literature and English literary traditions, which was enshrined in Lewis's work, and on the other hand, the attempt to try and in some sort of socialist perspective. And Raymond said in that characteristic way of his, well, I've been thinking about and writing about that too, and offered to show us what in fact were two chapters of Culture and Society, which we took away that summer, so the summer of 1956. And it's in the middle of reading those chapters that we got the news, first of all, of the invasion of Suez, and then of the Soviet invasion of Hungary, which in fact was the birth of the New Left, in which he was an absolutely pivotal figure. But another story, which in some ways more personal and more characteristic, was when in 1966, a number of us, including Terry Eagleton and Raymond and Edward Thompson and a number of others, met together in Cambridge to draft what became the May Day Manifesto. And we met in Raymond's rooms in Jesus College, which were in fact Coleridge's rooms. And it struck us all as so incongruous, you know, to meet to make this profound socialist statement in the midst of Jesus College, Cambridge. And Raymond was the only person who didn't find this at all incongruous. I mean, he just thought it was a very good place to meet, just like Cambridge for him all his life was a very good place to do serious intellectual work in. And I've never lost the sense of that, because so many intellectuals, including socialist intellectuals, have been profoundly remade by their engagement with Oxford or Cambridge and so on. And Raymond simply just was never touched in that deep way by it.
We're fortunate enough to have a short clip of Raymond talking, and perhaps you can now have a look at this before we go on to discuss the significance of his work.
At a certain point, it was assumed that by more production, you got both more equality and more significance and respect. And you have only to look at the most productive economies in the world, let alone ones which, like Britain, are relatively poor in production, to see that it doesn't matter how much you increase production in this gross way that was then thought about. You neither get rid of certain kinds of poverty, nor do you restore the sense of respect and meaning, precisely because the ironical end result of this emphasis on production is to make an increasing number of people, in that very cruel phrase, redundant. I mean, literally all that order of society can offer to an increasing number of people is the statement that they are not required. And this cancels the sense of meaning and respect in society at much more fundamental levels than even the labor processes. If you're finally going to say to an increasing number of people, you are simply surplus to requirements, you're not really necessary in the society. Now, at that point, the whole question returns, the basic questions of what people need to produce and how they need to produce it and how they relate to each other while they're producing it.
That's a very characteristic clip of Raymond talking and thinking. But perhaps now what we can do is to discuss the significance of his work for the future and the kind of influence that it might have not only in the next few years but also on the next generations of those who are thinking and working in this country and in Europe. Stuart?
Well, I think it is characteristic in so many ways because there's both somebody thinking on their feet, I mean, which is absolutely astonishing, you know, that he's in the middle of a transmission, but he never stops kind of holding on to the groove of what he's thinking and pushing it forward. It's that continual pushing forward, which is a kind of activity of thinking, which is very different from a cerebral activity of thinking, which is striking. Second thing is, you know, he's talking about production, and this is so characteristic. He takes an idea which is everywhere around in the media and among politicians, which everybody thinks they know what they're, and he begins to change the terms of the argument. You know, he makes you think about production in a different way, qualitatively, not quantitatively. And he then brings in the human consequences of thinking about it in one way. You know, so if you just think about it quantitatively, as the infinite expansion which constantly leaves out something else, the sense of respect for people and the communities which have made that production somehow separated language, you just don't see the underside of what production means. Now, in so many different contexts, literary, political, cultural, critical, etc., he takes these central words and just kind of quietly turns them around so that you can't engage with them in the old terms of reference anymore.
Was that the same when he was teaching?
Yes, I think one had a strange sense of a powerful intelligence which arose almost directly from a deep level of personal experience. He was quite striking in the way I think that those two things seemed to form a unity in him. He resisted attempts to divide those. But I also think he lived within a tension between those two things. He lived, to use one of his own metaphors, on a border between the common deep values that he always spoke out for and the life of educated consciousness, as he would say, which he'd crossed the border to. It was in a way a border between Wales and England, between the old working class community he'd known that had shaped and the metropolitan institutions that he'd gone out into. And I think he always knew that there was no way of resolving that tension intellectually. That tension was built for a class-divided society, and he just had to find a way of living it as best he could.
But when he wrote about Wales, he did so very often in his fiction. I mean, is his fiction very important in Wales? Do you think that would be an important influence in the country?
I think in his fiction he touched all the central dilemmas of Welsh society. The lack of political power, the fact that communities are disrupted by planners. I think the Fight for Manod, which is the third of the trilogies, is perhaps the clearest exposition by him of the way in which a community is remade. It's all about the attempt in the 60s to build a massive new town in the centre of Wales and how the local community resists it and how the planners who are involved in the work themselves find themselves inside a conflict, because on the one hand they want to create a new community, on the other hand the old community is resisting it. And at the end of that novel he has the central character standing on another border, which is the border between the rural part of Wales and the old industrial areas, and seeing that both these traditions are dying, but yet we must go on. And I think it was this combination of being able to analyse what was happening to society and yet keeping a faith that a community could be remade that is central in his work.
But I'm struck by the fact that of two things that are missing, it seems to me, so far from this discussion. and often from the idea of Raymond that is projected, because this idea is of somebody who is part of a community and part of a very, so to speak, English-British problem. But there were two very important parts of his work, for me at least. One was his work on drama, which he wrote about, and he was the professor of drama. And therefore the theatre, drama, television, film were very important for him. And secondly, that in the latter part of his life, he did begin to see himself very much as a European and was taking European thought on board and not just the English tradition. There was a real movement. I remember him saying that the difference between his later political work in the year 2000 and the earlier Long Revolution was the big difference between these two political assessments was that initially he thought that you could have socialism in Britain, but that now he felt that this was an impossible project in terms of the resources of this country alone. The profound generation never made that change. And I think that we should look, so to speak, to the Williams of the future rather than the Williams that is back there in the 50s or 60s.
I think towards 2000 will be seen, probably by the year 2000, as the central work of political theory written at the end of the 20th century, because it takes on board all the forms of new movement politics. It also maintains the centrality of a class politics based upon an idea of community and an idea of human needs beyond capitalism and beyond laborism. And the European connection, again, it becomes increasingly relevant now because, again, I don't see much of a future for the British left in isolation. I see very much the possibility of a European left re-emerging from the crisis of what the right has done to us. And in that context, I think Williams's thought is in the vanguard of European left thinking, because that thinking is still preoccupied, I think, with forms of intellectual life which are separate from community, forms of theory out of where people are at.
It's interesting you say that, and you're the leader of, if a still small political party, but one of the things that was very striking in the 60s was that Raymond, who was in a sense a natural thinker for people in the Labour Party and the Labour movement to turn to, was basically ignored by them. I mean, does he have in Wales a kind of a real political influence as a national figure?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I would say that the politics of the left in Wales, he is the central theoretical figure, and his work would be seen as a political programme. I mean, it is taken seriously as a political programme. One of the things that one regrets in his early death is that we didn't do more to develop that side of it, but certainly in his lectures to our party summer schools and various things which he did for us in the 60s and 70s, he very much emphasised the way in which he saw the practical politics of his work being applied in the communities that he came from.
Stuart, do you think there's any prospect of that happening this side of the border?
Well, I don't know about the prospects. I mean, I think what you said is certainly true, the reverse of that, which is that although in his attempt to go on thinking what might socialism mean now, which is, you know, a question which is at the center and heart of his work, and which was never thought by him as a set of programs or things which could be somehow, you know, plonked on top of society. It's not defined as one tried to make it, etc. But that project was, on the whole, really not understood, not heard by the majority of Labour. And I mean, that is a comment on the Philistinism and, you know, of the Labour tradition in England, not a comment on Raymond.
And I wanted to, in a way, stress how important I think his historical work is, that keywords, when keywords came out, it just seemed impossible that somebody hadn't even thought of doing it before. A dictionary of the history of words, how they've been used, concepts, like concepts actually being concrete objects almost with a history, a meaning and an effect, that words and ideas actually do something in the world. And his placing of the history of those things, his understanding and making them really clear so that, you know, they are easy to understand. You can see where they come from and how they've been used. That really is an important part of the project looking forward as well. I just wanted to bring that in because I teach using a lot of Williams's work, and I mean, I've sometimes personally gone out and bought keywords and given it to groups of students. I mean, literally handed it to them and just said, you know, really, if you read one thing, read this. It's so radical to understand where things come from, and it's only they could go and how they could change.
I think it's interesting that it's very hard to give Williams's whole project a conventional academic name, isn't it? I mean, he wasn't quite a philosopher, it wasn't quite sociology, literary criticism, political theory. He carved out a quite new area. He was the architect of a new area. That's what Judith's saying. If if there was one theme that was constant from start to finish, it was language and communication. He was deeply concerned with language and communication. But again, he wasn't a linguist in the conventional sense because the implications for him of those things ran so deeply and unraveled out all the time into concerns of pop and culture that you couldn't put him in that kind of box, that words for him were the crystallizations of human struggle, historical experience. They were sight-linked. And so what he did was to transform the very concept of communication.
Actually, what I was thinking is that for my generation, his work is like a sort of backdrop. I mean, I think people might not realise, people don't realise, students I teach who are like another generation again, don't realise in some ways how radical his work forms a complete backdrop for the whole field of sort of media studies, thinking, talking about television. In a way, like, we're almost taking that for granted in this debate, but I think people, even just watching this, the whole way that we talk and think now about communications and the media, just the amount we use the two words, the media, is relatively, that Williams's work, like his work on television, the book Communications, I mean, I remember it with the Pelican special.
One of the powerful things about that book, actually, not only did he analyse the media, but he ends with a quite bold, practical set of proposals for their social control. I hope I can say this in this context. That right from the outset, political power wasn't in communication. And towards the end of his life, in an interview I did with him, when we spoke about the enormous power of the media in he and what could be done about this and various proposals of reform, he said simply, these people have to be driven out.
Though he presents us with times with a very sharp choice between the old industrial capitalist order and its civilization and values and some alternative socialism. Socialism was never thought of or felt as complete. Yeah? I mean, the argument would then just start, we would then have to, new terms, yes, arguing what this was about, what this meant. There is that sense of kind of an unfinished project, which isn't easily measurable between the time when he has no influence and the time when he will. It's more the kind of instance he gave of what socialism would be like at full stretch. And that has something to do with about complexity. Because I think, from the beginning to the end, what attracted people to him was precisely this recognition of complexity. That everything had to be thought in terms of the difficulty. Of course, it was difficult. It's a complicated society. Making a new society and defining what a new social order is a huge act of common imagination. And of course, you need to be thinking all the time in order to do it right. And that he's kind of both talked about that and, in a sense, exemplified that. You could see that was what he was doing. So in that sense, he doesn't lead us to think about a socialism which would come. Yes. It is like being with Raymond. That's what it would be like.
This experience in my first novel, Border Country. He was sitting above the Kestrel, looking down across the valley. He'd come up past Parry's farm and the sheepfold, and over the long climbing ridge of Brynfylwyd. At first, the paths had been wide through the dense bracken, past the last cottages and the arcade. Then, where the bracken dropped back, the wilder country of heather and wind stretched ahead. The paths became narrower, the air colder, and the mountains around took on different shapes, their moulding clearer. He looked out in each direction in turn. His eyes narrowed against the keen wind. The mountain had this power to abstract and to clarify, but in the end he could not stay here. He must go back down where he lived. On the way down, the shapes faded, ordinary identities returned.